before sunrise. While most of East Asia was still dark, a Japanese destroyer moved south into one of the most watched stretches of water on Earth. It did not drift there by accident. It did not get lost. It did not wander into a gray zone and then quietly back out. It went straight through the Taiwan Strait for roughly 14 hours. That ship stayed inside waters Beijing treats not as an international passage, but as a political test. Chinese surveillance followed it. Warnings came over the radios. Sensors lit up. The entire transit was watched in real time. And yet the one thing Beijing did not do was the one thing that matters most. It did not stop the ship. That is where the real story begins. Because the real story is not that one Japanese destroyer crossed one strait. The real story is that Japan has reached the point where it is no longer willing to let China define the psychological boundaries of the Western Pacific. And the moment that ship kept moving south, while Beijing watched and condemned and did nothing physical to stop it. A much larger truth came into view. China has spent years building pressure. Japan has now started answering the pressure as a system. That is why this transit matters so much. If this had happened in isolation, it would still have been dramatic. A Japanese warship moving through the Taiwan Strait is not routine political theater. It is an unmistakable signal. But this did not happen in isolation. It came after months of tightening pressure, after repeated gray zone operations, after maritime harassment around the Senkaku Islands, after civilian-looking fleets were used as strategic instruments, after Beijing rehearsed the logic of blockade without formally declaring one, and it came just 8 hours after Russian warships visited China. That timing matters, because it tells you this was not a navigational choice. It was a message. Tokyo was not simply sailing a ship through contested water. Tokyo was answering a growing structure of coercion that Beijing has been building piece by piece across the region. Look at the sequence, and the pattern becomes impossible to miss. For years, China has tried to create a new normal in East Asian waters without firing the first major shot. It does this through accumulation, one Coast Guard intrusion, one militia swarm, one restricted airspace, notice, one intimidation patrol, one rehearsal that looks temporary but teaches everyone how a future blockade might feel. None of these moves alone changes the map. Together, they are meant to change behavior. That is the method. China does not need every confrontation to end in a military clash. It only needs enough repeated pressure to make its neighbors act smaller, quieter, more careful, more hesitant. It needs them to begin living inside China as preferred rules before those rules are formally imposed. That is why the Taiwan Strait transit matters. Japan was not only transiting a waterway, it was refusing the psychological enclosure that Beijing has been trying to build around the region. And nowhere is that enclosure more important than in the first island chain. This is the deeper structure beneath the headline from southern Japan down through Okinawa and toward Taiwan. Geography creates a line that Chinese military planners have obsessed over for decades. That line narrows the exits through which Chinese naval power has to move if it wants regular, uncontested access to the wider Pacific. If China wants to turn fleet size into true maritime reach, it has to break the feeling of confinement created by that geography. Japan sits directly on that problem. That is why the waters around the Senkaku Islands matter so much. That is why the Miyako Strait matters so much. That is why gray zone pressure around Japan is never just about fishing boats, coast guards, or symbolic sovereignty patrols. It is about wearing down the state that sits on one of the locks of the Pacific. Beijing wants freedom of movement. Japan's geography complicates that freedom. So China applies pressure where geography meets political patience. That pressure has not been abstract. In the months before this transit, tension around the Senkaku area sharpened. Again, Chinese vessels did not merely appear. They lingered, tested, patrolled, measured response times, and tried to normalize the idea that Japanese-administered waters could be entered and contested at will. Civilian-looking formations appeared in ways that did not feel civilian at all. Maritime militia tactics blurred the line between fishing presence and strategic encirclement. This is one of China's most effective tools. Instead of overt warships every time, use platforms that complicate escalation, use numbers, use ambiguity, use deniability, use civilian skins over strategic intent, force the other side to either look passive or look aggressive for responding too hard. That is how you squeeze a rival without formally crossing the threshold into open war. And Japan has been watching this for years, which is why the destroyer moving through the Taiwan Strait should not be read as an impulsive act. It should be read as the visible crest of a shift that has been building underneath for a long time. Japan has concluded that if it only reacts case by case, incident by incident, vessel by vessel, it will spend the next decade answering fragments while China reshapes the whole environment. So Tokyo is starting to answer the whole environment. That is the strategic translation of the transit. The ship did not simply pass through a strait, it declared that China's coercive architecture will no longer be treated as a series of isolated annoyances, it will be treated as what it is, a connected campaign. Once you see that, the rest of the story opens up. Take the so-called blockade rehearsal. When Beijing conducts prolonged exercises, restricts airspace, saturates nearby waters with state and quasi-state maritime presence, and rehearses the mechanics of strangulation around Taiwan. It is not only practicing for a future military contingency, it is also sending a regional message. It is asking every neighboring capital the same question. If this becomes normal, what will you actually do? Will you protest and adapt? Will you condemn and wait? Will you reassure yourself that this is only temporary, or will you act early while the rules are still being written? Japan's transit through the Taiwan Strait was part of Tokyo's answer to that question, and it was answered in full view of Beijing. That is why the Chinese reaction matters almost as much as the Japanese action. The official condemnation was harsh, the rhetoric was predictable. The language was meant to punish politically what could not be stopped physically. But condemnation has a limit once a ship has already passed. Once the transit is complete, once the cameras have captured the fact that the challenge happened and no kinetic response followed, the diplomatic anger starts to sound like compensation. This is the humiliation embedded in the headline. Not humiliation in the childish sense, humiliation in the strategic sense. A state that wants everyone to believe it can progressively define the operating environment around Taiwan and the East China Sea had to watch a major regional power violate the atmosphere of fear it had worked so hard to build, and that is difficult to hide. It gets worse for Beijing when you widen the lens, because this was not only about China, Russia was in the frame too. Just 2 days before the transit, Russian warships had made their visit to China. That was supposed to project a familiar image. The two powers coordinating, signaling endurance, reminding the region that pressure can come from more than one direction. China from the south and center, Russia from the north, joint presence, joint atmosphere, joint intimidation. Japan knows that picture very well. In the north, Tokyo still faces the unresolved wound of the northern territories and the strategic consequences of Russia's military posture around the Kurils and the Sea of Okhotsk Russian naval movement. Around Japan is not theoretical. Japanese planners have had to think for years about a northern challenge and a southern challenge at the same time. So when a Japanese destroyer moved through the Taiwan Strait less than 48 hours after a Russian naval visit to China, the message was larger than China alone. Tokyo was saying that a two-front atmosphere of intimidation will not automatically produce Japanese caution. That matters because China and Russia do not need a formal combined operation every day to create combined pressure. Sometimes simultaneous posture is enough, sometimes proximity of signals is enough. Sometimes one visit in one port and one patrol in one strait are enough to create the feeling that regional balance is shifting and that resistance is becoming costlier. Japan answered that feeling directly. Now, to understand why Tokyo could answer that way, you have to look at what Japan has been building for a long time. Outsiders talked about Japan as if its strategic identity were frozen forever after World War II pacifist constitution caution, minimal response. A country that would worry, condemn, and avoid going too far. That description is too old. Now, Japan is still constrained in important ways, but it is no longer psychologically organized around passivity. The country has been slowly, deliberately accumulating the tools of a harder maritime posture. Its helicopter carriers have been transformed into platforms that can support F-35B operations. That matters, not because two ships automatically rewrite the balance of power, but because it changes how Japan can distribute air power across maritime space. A moving deck is not just a platform, it is political reach. Its destroyer force is large, modern, and increasingly integrated into a broader deterrent concept. Its missile programs extend the distance at which Japan can impose cost. Its submarines make narrow passages more dangerous for any fleet that assumes routine access to open water. Its alliance structure multiplies the effect of its own capabilities, and none of this exists in a vacuum. Japan's power matters because it sits on geography that already favors obstruction. Add capable ships, anti-ship missiles, quiet submarines, and mobile air power to geography, and the first island chain stops being just a line on a map. It becomes a pressure system of its own that is Beijing's deeper problem. China can build more hulls, it can expand shipyards, it can produce volume, but volume does not erase choke points. Volume does not erase narrow exits. Volume does not erase the fact that a rival sitting on the right islands with the right tools can make expansion outward much more dangerous than it looks on paper. This is why Japan's move had such force. It turned theory into image. For years, analysts could talk abstractly about first, island chain constraints, maritime choke points, gray zone escalation, and Chinese pressure campaigns. But then a single Japanese destroyer moved through the Taiwan Strait and gave the whole discussion a cinematic form. One ship, one transit, one undeniable image. And behind that image, a strategic sentence. Japan is no longer accepting China's pressure campaign as the natural background of Asian security. That does not mean Japan wants war. It does not mean Tokyo is reckless. It does not mean every future transit will look like this. It means Japan has crossed a mental threshold, and those mental thresholds matter because they change the menu of future actions. Once a country proves to itself that it can do something highly sensitive in full view of an adversary and survive the moment, the next decision becomes easier, the taboo has been broken, the fear loses some of its monopoly. The opponent's aura becomes more testable. That is why Beijing should worry about what this transit means beyond the day itself. The danger is not only that Japan sailed through, the danger is that other regional actors study the episode and draw a broader lesson. Chinese pressure can be answered, not just endured. That is how systems begin to shift, not always through one giant war, sometimes through a chain of smaller moments in which fear stops compounding on one side and starts eroding instead. And once that erosion begins, the cost of maintaining intimidation rises sharply. China now has a harder problem than before. If it responds too softly to future moves, more states may begin testing the perimeter. If it responds too hard, it risks accelerating the regional balancing coalition it most wants to weaken. That is the trap inside pressure politics. The stronger the pressure architecture becomes, the more a successful act of defiance can expose the fact that pressure is not the same thing as control. And what Japan exposed in the Taiwan Strait was exactly that gap. Pressure is not control. Presence is not sovereignty. Condemnation is not interdiction. A watch transit is not a stop transit. That is the sentence Beijing will want to bury. Now look ahead. The Taiwan Strait will not suddenly become calm. The East China Sea will not relax. The Senkaku issue is not going away. Russian pressure in the north is not disappearing. China's maritime militia tactics are not ending. Because of one moment, Taiwan is not safer because of one destroyer. But the strategic atmosphere has changed. Japan has shown that it is willing to answer not just individual incidents, but the wider structure that links them together. It has shown that the old assumption of Japanese hesitation can no longer be treated as a fixed law of Asian politics. And it has shown that Beijing's attempt to turn surrounding waters into a zone of one-way intimidation will meet something heavier now than statements of concern. That is why this story will matter long after the headlines move on, because historians and strategists rarely remember only the biggest battles. They also remember the moments when a regional power made it unmistakably clear that an old psychological order had ended. This may prove to be one of those moments. A Japanese destroyer moved through the Taiwan Strait before sunrise. China tracked it, denounced it, and let it pass. And in that gap between surveillance and action, between anger and restraint, between pressure and control, the region saw something it was not supposed to see. So clearly, Japan is no longer just living inside China's maritime pressure system. It has started to answer it. And once that answer has been given in steel, in motion, in full public view, the Pacific does not go back to what it was before. The old Japan that absorbed pressure and hoped the storm would pass is fading. The Japan now emerging looks very different. It is not waiting for the map to be changed around it. It has decided to step into the water and contest the change itself.